The rain didn't just fall in Detroit that Tuesday. It hammered against the world like a grievance, relentless and cold, a gray curtain that seemed to swallow the very hope of the city. Inside the small, drafty apartment on 4th Street, Sarah stood by the kitchen window, watching the water streak down the glass in jagged, irregular lines. The apartment always felt colder when it rained. The wind would whistle through the gaps in the aging window frames, a haunting, low-pitched sound that reminded her of everything they lacked. In her hand, she held the electric bill. It was crinkled, worn soft from how many times she had folded and unfolded it throughout the day, staring at the number in the bottom right corner, $142. It wasn't a fortune to most people. To the people in the high-rises downtown, it was a lunch tab at a steakhouse or a pair of designer socks. But for Sarah, it was a mountain. It was the physical manifestation of her failure to provide a better life for herself. It was the difference between a warm meal and a dark, freezing house. She heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots in the hallway. The sound was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, a slow, tired gait that spoke of miles walked on hard concrete and hours spent standing over buckets of dirty water. The jingle of keys followed, a metallic symphony of the working class. Welcome to my channel. I share new life stories here every day, and I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe and liked my video. Now let's jump back into the story. Sarah quickly shoved the bill into her apron pocket, smoothing her expression into a mask of contentment. She wouldn't burden him, not tonight. He had enough weight on his shoulders. The door creaked open, struggling against the swollen wood of the frame, and John stepped in. A gust of wet, cold air followed him, carrying the scent that had defined their last 10 years of marriage. Industrial bleach, pine cleaner, and the heavy, humid smell of sheer physical exhaustion. John was a big man, broad-shouldered and strong, a man built for labor. But the years of scrubbing floors at the elementary school had given him a permanent stoop, as if the ceiling were always a little too low for him, as if the world was trying to press him down into the very dirt he cleaned. He pulled off his woolen cap, his hair graying at the temples much faster than it should have for a man in his 40s. He gave her a weary grin, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes but held all the love he couldn't put into words. "Hey, beautiful," he rasped, his voice rough from years of breathing in cleaning chemicals and cold morning air. "Soup smells good. I could smell it from the bottom of the stairs." It was the only thing keeping me walking. Sarah walked over and took his coat. It was heavy with rain, weighing nearly 20 pounds, dripping onto the linoleum floor. "It's just potato and leek, John, it's not much. I wish I could have made that roast you like, but the market was, well, you know." He kissed her forehead, his lips cold and chapped. "It's hot and it's yours, that makes it a feast in my book. I don't need fancy meat to feel like a king, Sarah." This was the core of John. He never complained, he never asked for more. He was a janitor, a man who cleaned up the messes of children who would grow up to be richer than he would ever be, and yet he came home every night with a gratitude that baffled Sarah. She loved him for it, but tonight, with the electric bill burning a hole in her pocket, his contentment felt like a weight. It felt like they were drowning in slow motion, and he was just happy they were holding hands while they went under. They sat at the small, scratched wooden table. The legs were uneven, propped up by a folded piece of cardboard from an old cereal box. The silence was comfortable, born of a decade of shared struggle until the phone rang. Sarah flinched. She knew who it was. Only one person called at this hour with that specific, aggressive persistence. "Hello?" Sarah answered. "Sarah, oh my God, you finally answered. I was just about to hang up and call the diner to see if you were pulling a double shift again. You know, you really should get a cell phone that actually works." The voice was high, sharp, and laced with the kind of faux cheerfulness that set Sarah's teeth on edge. It was Brenda, her sister. "Hi, Brenda, no, I'm home, we're eating dinner." "Dinner at 8 p.m.? Oh, right, John's hours. I keep forgetting he works the late shift. Listen, I can't talk long, we're packing." Mark just got his bonus. Sarah, you wouldn't believe the numbers, 5 figures, and he surprised me with a trip to Aspen. "Skiing, can you imagine me on skis? We're staying at the St. Regis." "I already bought 3 new coats." Sarah gripped the phone cord, her knuckles turning white. "That sounds lovely, Brenda, you deserve a break." I know, right? Anyway, I was calling because Mom said your car broke down again. Mark was saying, why doesn't John just get a real job? And I told him, Mark, be nice, someone has to empty the trash cans. But honestly, Sarah, I worry about you. The family reunion is coming up next month. You are coming, right? The entry fee for the country club venue is 50 a head, but if you guys are, tight, Mark can cover you. We don't want you to miss out just because things are hard. It would be embarrassing if the whole family was there and you weren't. The shame was a hot flush rising up Sarah's neck, stinging her cheeks like a physical slap. Charity, pity from her own sister. She looked at John, who was quietly dipping bread into his soup, pretending not to hear the loud, piercing voice from the receiver. We're fine, Brenda, Sarah lied, her voice trembling slightly with the effort to remain calm. We'll be there. And we can pay our own way. We don't need Mark's money. We have everything we need. Okay, okay, don't get defensive. Just trying to help the less fortunate. Kisses. The line clicked dead. Sarah set the phone down, her appetite gone, replaced by a bitter stone in her stomach. John looked up. His eyes were dark, soulful, and uncomfortably perceptive. Brenda, he asked quietly. Brenda, Sarah confirmed. She sat down, burying her face in her hands, her hair falling forward to hide the tears she couldn't stop. She's going to Aspen. Mark got a massive bonus. She offered to pay for our dinner at the reunion, John. She treated me like a charity case in front of everyone. She acts like our life is some kind of tragedy she has to watch from a safe distance. John reached across the table and took her hand. His palms were calloused, the skin rough like sandpaper from years of pushing mops and lugging heavy machinery. Let them talk, Sarah. We have a roof that only leaks a little. We have food on the table. We have each other. Isn't that enough? Does Mark have someone who loves him for who he is, or just for the bonus checks? Sarah pulled her hand away, the frustration finally boiling over after years of suppression. No, John, it's not enough. I'm tired of counting pennies. I'm tired of being the poor relation that everyone whispers about at Christmas. I love you, I do, but I look at you and I see how hard you work, and it kills me that the world doesn't care. You're a janitor, John. You've been a janitor for 20 years. Don't you ever want more? Don't you ever want to walk into a room and have people look at you with respect instead of looking through you like you're part of the furniture? The question hung in the air, heavy and cruel. John's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to dim slightly, the light of his quiet happiness flickering out for a moment. He stood up slowly, picking up his bowl. I'm happy, Sarah. I thought you were too. He walked to the sink to wash his dish, the sound of the water the only thing filling the silence. The next few hours were spent in a cold, uncomfortable quiet. Sarah felt the guilt gnawing at her she shouldn't have snapped. John was a good man. He was loyal, he was kind, and he worked himself to the bone for their small life. But the sight of that electric bill and the sound of Brenda's voice had snapped something inside her. She felt trapped in a loop of poverty that had no exit. Later that night, as the city outside turned into a blur of neon and rain, John was in the shower. Sarah was gathering his dirty uniform to put in the wash. The heavy blue coveralls smelled of sweat, floor wax, and the dusty corners of a world no one else wanted to touch. As she checked the pockets, a habit born of years of ensuring no tissues or screws destroyed the washing machine, her fingers brushed against something stiff and cold. It wasn't a tissue, she pulled it out. It was a receipt, but not a receipt for hardware or a burger. It was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind used by luxury boutiques. The header read, "The Gilded Lily Fine Jewelry and Timepieces." Her breath caught in her throat. She scanned the lines. Item, vintage Patek Philippe watch, repair and restoration. Cost $4,200, paid cash. Sarah stared at the paper until the words blurred into meaningless shapes. $4,000, that was more than their car was worth. That was 6 months of rent and groceries. That was the electric bill paid 40 times over. John didn't own a watch like that. John owned a $10 plastic digital watch he bought at a gas station that barely kept time. Her mind raced, spiraling into dark, jagged corners. Did he find it in a trash can at the school? If he found it, why pay to repair it? And most importantly, where did a man who makes $15 an hour get $4,000 in cash? Was he stealing? Was he working for someone dangerous, or worse, was there another woman? A woman he bought expensive things for while Sarah spent her afternoons clipping coupons for generic cereal and mending holes in her socks. The shower water turned off with a sharp metallic clunk. Sarah quickly shoved the receipt into her own apron pocket, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She turned as John walked into the bedroom, drying his hair with a threadbare towel. He looked the same, tired, simple, loving. He looked like the man who had just apologized for not being enough. But for the first time in 10 years, Sarah looked at her husband and realized she was living with a stranger. The man she thought she knew would never have $4,000 in cash. The man she thought she knew didn't have secrets. "You okay, Sarah?" John asked, noticing her frozen posture. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice sounding hollow even to her own ears. "Just tired. I think I'll go to bed early." "Good idea," John said, hanging up his towel. "It's been a long day for both of us." As he climbed into bed and fell asleep almost instantly, his breathing heavy and deep, Sarah stayed awake. She stared at the ceiling, the receipt a heavy weight in her pocket. She realized then that she couldn't just ask him. If he was lying about this, he would lie about the answer. She needed to know the truth for herself. She needed to know who John Miller really was when he wasn't scrubbing floors. The next morning, the sun didn't rise so much as the sky simply turned a bruised metallic gray. Sarah lay in bed, her eyes tracing the familiar cracks in the plaster ceiling, listening to the rhythmic sounds of John's morning routine. The squeak of the bathroom floorboard, the rush of the shower, the clink of a spoon against a ceramic bowl. To any other wife, these were the comforting sounds of a predictable life. To Sarah, they now sounded like the meticulously timed cues of a performance. She waited until she heard the heavy thud of the front door closing. She counted to 60, her heart thumping in time with the ticking clock on the bedside table. Then she moved. She didn't head to the diner. She didn't put on her waitress uniform. Instead, she threw on an old trench coat and a silk scarf, tying it tightly under her chin. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror of the hallway. Her eyes were wide, shadowed by a lack of sleep and a growing, cold determination. She looked like a woman on the edge of a cliff, and in many ways she was. She climbed into her battered Ford, the one Brenda had mocked, and waited. John's truck, a blue 1998 F-150 that rattled like a bucket of bolts, pulled away from the curb 3 houses down. Sarah shifted into gear, keeping a 3-car gap between them. Her hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, the plastic groaning under the pressure. "Please be going to the school," she whispered to the empty car. "Please just be going to Lincoln Elementary." For the first mile, it seemed her prayer was answered. John took the usual route, driving past the rusted-out factories and the boarded-up storefronts of their neighborhood. But at the intersection of Grand and 12th, where he should have turned left toward the school district, the blue truck's blinker signaled a right. Sarah's stomach dropped, a cold, heavy stone falling into the pit of her gut. He was heading toward the highway. He was heading toward downtown. The drive was 20 minutes of pure, agonizing suspense. John drove with a strange, calm precision. He didn't speed. He didn't weave through traffic. He drove like a man who had nowhere to be, yet knew exactly where he was going. Sarah followed him onto the ominous 94, merging into the flow of sleek black SUVs and luxury sedans that populated the city's business vein. The scenery began to change. The crumbling brick of the outskirts gave way to the towering glass and steel of the financial district. Here, the buildings didn't just stand. They loomed, reflecting the gray sky in their tinted windows like silent titans. John took the exit for the Millennium Tower. Sarah's breath hitched. The Millennium Tower was the tallest, most exclusive skyscraper in the city, the kind of place where the lobby smelled of expensive lilies and the security guards looked like Secret Service agents. John didn't park on the street. He drove straight into the underground parking structure, a subterranean lair reserved for the city's elite. Sarah pulled over to the curb, her engine idling roughly. She couldn't follow him inside. The gate required a black keycard she knew he shouldn't possess. She sat there for 10 minutes, her mind spinning. Maybe he was cleaning there, maybe the school district had a contract, but the school was 10 miles in the opposite direction. Then the pedestrian door of the garage opened. Sarah ducked down, peering over her dashboard, her pulse drumming in her ears. A man stepped out. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit, tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, catching the dim morning light. He moved with a predator's grace, shoulders back, chin up, his stride long and filled with an absolute terrifying confidence. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. It was John. Gone was the stoop. Gone was the weary shuffle of the man who scrubbed floors. This man looked like he owned the pavement he walked on. He looked like the kind of man who made decisions that moved markets. He walked straight to the main entrance of the Millennium Tower. The doorman, a man who usually looked through people like Sarah as if they were ghosts, rushed forward, his face breaking into a look of pure, subservient terror. "Good morning, sir," the doorman said, bowing his head. John didn't say a word. He merely gave a sharp nod and breezed past into the marble lobby. Sarah was out of her car before she could think. She ran across the street, dodging a yellow taxi that honked angrily at her. She pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors, the sudden warmth of the lobby hitting her like a wave. The air was thick with the scent of wealth, lemon oil, expensive leather, and success. She saw him. He was stepping into a private elevator, the one guarded by two men in suits. The doors slid shut with a soft, expensive hiss. "Excuse me." "Miss," a security guard, a man the size of a mountain, stepped into her path. "You can't be in here without an appointment." "That man," Sarah panted, pointing at the closed elevator doors. "The one who just went up, I need to see him." That's my husband." The guard looked her up and down. He saw the old trench coat, the faded scarf, the worn-out sneakers. A slow, condescending smirk spread across his face. "Your husband." "Lady, do you know who that is?" "His name is John Miller," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "He's a janitor. He works for the school district." The guard let out a harsh, dry laugh. "A janitor, miss, you've clearly got the wrong building. That elevator goes exclusively to the 60th floor penthouse and the executive boardroom of Hargrave Global. The man who just went up there is Mr. John Hargrave. He doesn't clean floors, he owns them. He owns this building. He probably owns the street you parked on." Sarah felt the world tilt. The marble floor seemed to liquefy beneath her feet. Hargrave, the name echoed in her mind like a bell. Everyone knew the name Hargrave. It was on the side of hospitals, on the brass plaques of museums, on the news tickers of every financial channel. John Hargrave was a ghost, a reclusive billionaire who rarely gave interviews and never appeared at social galas. "You're lying," Sarah whispered. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave, ma'am," the guard said, his voice losing its amusement and turning professional and cold. "Before I have to escort you out. We don't appreciate people coming in here making scenes." He grabbed her elbow, not roughly, but with a firm, unyielding pressure, and led her back toward the revolving doors. Sarah didn't fight him. She felt numb, her body moving on autopilot. She stepped back onto the cold sidewalk, the wind whipping her scarf around her face. She sat on a concrete planter, her phone shaking in her hands. She opened a search engine and typed in John Hargrave. The results loaded instantly. There were very few photos, but the ones that existed were unmistakable. A younger version of her John standing in front of a jet. A grainy shot of him leaving a courthouse. The bio read, John Hargrave, CEO and founder of Hargrave Global. Net worth $4.2 billion, known for his intense privacy and hands-on management style. Sarah felt a sick, hot bile rise in her throat. $4 billion. Every memory of the last 10 years began to rewrite itself in her mind, turning into something grotesque. She thought of the time they had sat in the dark for 3 hours because the power had flickered out and they were afraid they couldn't pay the bill. John had sat there with her, holding her hand, telling her it was romantic to eat sandwiches by candlelight. It wasn't romance, she realized with a jolt of horror. It was a lie. She thought of the times she had stitched his socks, her eyes straining in the dim light. She thought of the times she had skipped lunch so he could have a second helping of stew. She thought of the way she had defended him against Brenda's sharp tongue, her heart aching with the need to protect her poor, hardworking husband. He had watched her. He had sat across the table from her and watched her suffer. He had watched her cry over a $100 bill while he had billions sitting in a bank account. It wasn't just a secret. It was a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical wound. She felt like a specimen in a jar. Had he been testing her? Was she some kind of social experiment? Or was she just a pawn in some sick game he played to make himself feel real? The rage began to sharpen, replacing the numbness. It was a cold, crystalline anger. She looked up at the 60th floor of the Millennium Tower, her eyes narrowing. He thought he could live two lives. He thought he could keep her in the dark while he played king in the clouds. She stood up, her sneakers hitting the pavement with a new, firm purpose. She wasn't going back to the diner, and she wasn't going to confront him yet. She wanted to see just how deep this rabbit hole went. She walked back to her car and pulled out her notepad. She would wait. She would wait until the man in the charcoal suit came back out. She would see where John Hargrave went when the sun went down. For the next 8 hours, Sarah became a ghost herself. She sat in a coffee shop across the street, her eyes never leaving the entrance of the tower. She watched the high-powered executives come and go, their lives revolving around the man she thought she knew. She saw a delivery truck bring in massive bouquets of flowers. She saw a black SUV with tinted windows pull up to the curb, idling for hours. Finally, at 5 p.m. sharp, the doors opened. John emerged, but he wasn't alone. He was flanked by two men in suits, bodyguards. They walked him to the waiting SUV. He didn't look like a janitor. He didn't even look like the man who had kissed her forehead that morning. He looked untouchable. The SUV pulled away and Sarah followed. This time she didn't head home. The SUV led her to a private gym on the outskirts of the city, then to a high-end tailor, and finally to a small, nondescript warehouse in the industrial district. Sarah watched from the shadows of a nearby alley as John stepped out of the SUV and entered the warehouse. 10 minutes later, the blue Ford F-150 pulled out of the same warehouse. John was back in his coveralls. His shoulders were slumped again. He looked tired. He looked poor. He was changing. Every day, he was shedding his skin like a snake, shifting from a billionaire to a beggar just to come home to her. Sarah felt a sob catch in her throat, but she swallowed it. She didn't want to cry. She wanted the truth. She drove home, beating him by only a few minutes. She sat in the dark kitchen, the receipt from the jewelry store sitting on the table in front of her. She didn't turn on the lights. She waited for the sound of the rattling truck. She waited for the jingle of the keys. She waited for the man who had been lying to her for 3,650 days. The door opened. The scent of bleach and pine hit the air. "Sarah," John's voice called out, sounding weary and familiar. "Why is it so dark in here? Did the bulb go out again?" Sarah reached out and flipped the switch on the small lamp on the table. The light was harsh, illuminating the receipt and the printout of the John Hargrave bio she had made at the library. "The bulbs are fine, John," she said, her voice as cold as the rain outside. "But the lights are finally on for me. Or should I call you Mr. Hargrave?" The silence that followed Sarah's words was not empty. It was a physical thing, thick and suffocating like a blanket thrown over a fire. John stood frozen in the doorway, his hand still gripping the brass doorknob. The yellow light of the kitchen lamp carved deep, harsh shadows into his face. For a fleeting second, the John she knew, the tired, humble janitor, flickered in his eyes. But then something shifted. His spine straightened. The slouch that had defined his silhouette for a decade vanished, and the man who owned the Millennium Tower stood in his place. "Sarah," he said, his voice was different. The gravelly, rough tone of a man who shouted over industrial vacuums was gone, replaced by a smooth, cultured baritone that sounded like it belonged in a boardroom. "I was going to tell you. I had a plan for tonight." Sarah let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. It was a jagged, ugly sound. "A plan? Was it a 10-year plan, John? Because that's how long we've been married. That's how long I've washed your janitor uniforms. That's how long I've cried myself to sleep wondering if we'd be homeless by the time we were 50. When exactly was tonight supposed to happen in the last 3,000 days?" John walked into the room, his movements no longer hesitant. He sat down across from her at the small, wobbly table. He looked at the receipt for the Patek Philippe and the printout of his own face. He didn't look guilty. He looked profoundly, devastatingly sad. You found the receipt, he murmured, more to himself than to her. I should have been more careful. I wanted that watch restored because it was my father's. It was the only thing I had left of him before the Empire took over everything. The Empire, Sarah spat the word out. You talk about it like it's a burden. You have billions, John. Do you have any idea what it's like to stand on your feet for 12 hours at a diner, smiling at people who treat you like dirt, just so you can afford to buy generic brand milk? Do you know what it's like to have your own sister offer you charity while you sit there and say nothing? I know exactly what it's like, John said, his voice rising with a sudden, sharp intensity. I know because I've been doing it with you. I've been in those schools, Sarah. I've scrubbed those toilets. I've taken the insults from the principals and the parents. I didn't just play a part, I lived it. I wanted to remember what it felt like to be human. To be more than a number on a Forbes list. You were playing at being poor, Sarah screamed, her hands slamming onto the table. You had an escape hatch, you have a private jet and a penthouse. I don't get to go back to a warehouse and change my clothes to become a billionaire when I'm tired of being a waitress. That's not living it, John, that's tourism. You were a tourist in my misery. John reached out to take her hand, but she recoiled as if he were a snake. He winced, his fingers curling back into a fist. Listen to me, Sarah, please. When I was 24, I inherited Hargrave Global. My parents died, and suddenly I was the most powerful man in the city. I thought I was lucky. I thought I had the world, but I quickly realized that I was the loneliest person on the planet. Every friend I had was looking for a loan. Every woman I dated was looking for a ring and a prenup. I was a checkbook with a heartbeat. He leaned forward, his eyes searching hers, desperate for a glimmer of the woman who had loved him yesterday. I met a woman once, Vanessa. I loved her, or I thought I did. We were engaged. I decided to test her. I told her the company was under investigation, that the feds were seizing everything, and we'd have to move into a studio apartment in the suburbs. She didn't even pack her bags, Sarah. She left her engagement ring on the nightstand and was gone before I could finish the sentence. She didn't love John, she loved the Hargrave name. So you decided to find a woman you could trick, Sarah whispered. That was your solution. To start a relationship based on a massive, systemic lie. I wanted to be loved for me, John said, his voice breaking. I moved into this neighborhood. I got a job as a subcontracted cleaner. I met you at that diner. Do you remember? You gave me an extra slice of pie because you said I looked like I'd had a hard day. You didn't know I could have bought the entire diner and the block it stood on. You just saw a man who looked tired. For the first time in my life, someone saw me, not the money, not the power, just John. And that justified lying to me for 10 years. It wasn't supposed to be 10 years, John admitted, rubbing his face with his hands. At first, I thought I'd tell you after 6 months, but we were so happy, Sarah. For the first time in my life, I had peace. When I came home to this apartment, I wasn't the CEO who had to fire 500 people or navigate a hostile takeover. I was just a husband, your husband. I was terrified that if I told you that would die. I was scared you'd start looking at me like everyone else does with dollar signs in your eyes. I was scared that even if you didn't, the world would ruin us. The paparazzi, the lawyers, the fake friends. I wanted to protect this. I wanted to protect us. By letting me suffer, Sarah's voice was a low, dangerous growl. You watched me cry over the electric bill 2 days ago. You sat there and watched me crumble because I didn't think we could keep the lights on. How could you do that? How could you watch the person you claim to love be in pain when you had the cure in your pocket? John looked down at his calloused hands, the hands of a worker. Maintained through actual labor, he insisted on performing to keep his cover. I tried to help in ways that wouldn't tip you off. I bought this building through a holding company 3 years ago so I could keep the rent from rising. I paid the mechanic at the shop to tell you the car repairs were cheaper than they were. I was trying to balance the life we had with the resources I had, but I saw you 2 nights ago. I saw the look on your face when Brenda called, and I realized I'd let it go too far. I realized that my fear of losing you had turned me into a monster. He stood up and walked to the closet, pulling out a small, heavy safe hidden behind a pile of old shoes. He punched in a code and pulled out a velvet box. He didn't open it, he just set it on the table next to the receipt. I bought that for our anniversary, John said. It's not just a watch repair, Sarah. It's a piece of jewelry that belonged to the Queen of England. It's worth more than this entire apartment building. I was going to give it to you tonight. I was going to tell you everything. I was going to take you to the Millennium Tower and show you the world I built for you. I wanted to tell you that you never have to work another day in your life. That Brenda will never be able to look down on you again. Sarah looked at the velvet box. It represented a life of unimaginable luxury, diamonds, private jets, security, and fame. It was everything she had ever dreamed of when she was tired and hungry, but as she looked at it, all she felt was a profound sense of loss. "You think this fixes it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You think you can just buy my forgiveness with a diamond?" "No," John said. "I think I can spend the rest of my life earning it. I'm done with the lies, Sarah. I'm stepping down as CEO. I've already started the paperwork. I want to build something with you, something real. No more janitor suits, no more secret warehouses, just us." Sarah stood up, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted to scream and walk out the door, to leave the man who had treated her life like a game of the prince and the pauper. But another part of her, the part that had lived with him for 10 years, knew that his love was real. The man who had held her when she was sick, who had fixed the leaky faucets, who had listened to her dreams, that man was real. He was just buried under a mountain of gold. "I need time, John," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can't just flip a switch and be a billionaire's wife. I don't even know who I am anymore if I'm not the woman who struggles to make ends meet." "Take all the time you need," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "But Sarah, there's one more thing, the family reunion, it's this weekend." Sarah looked at him, a slow, cold realization dawning on her. She thought of Brenda's mocking voice, of Mark's condescending offers of charity, of her family's decades of subtle and overt cruelty. "You still want to go?" she asked. John's eyes sparked with a sudden, ruthless light, the look of the man who had conquered the business world. "I think we should go," he said. "But not as the poor relations. I think it's time the family met the man you actually married, and I think it's time Brenda learned a lesson she will never forget." Sarah looked at the man standing in her kitchen, her husband, the janitor, the billionaire. She looked at the velvet box on the table. For the first time in 48 hours, the anger in her chest shifted. It didn't disappear, but it moved aside to make room for something else, something dark and satisfying. "Okay, John," she said, her voice steadying. "We'll go, but we're doing it my way." The Oakwood Country Club sat like a fortress of old money on the outskirts of the city, a sprawling estate of whitewashed brick, manicured emerald lawns, and a parking lot that looked like a showroom for European luxury. It was the kind of place where the air always seemed a few degrees cooler, and the grass was cut with such precision it looked like velvet. For the Miller family, it was the pinnacle of status. For Brenda and Mark, it was their home turf, a place where they could flex their mid-level executive muscles and remind everyone else exactly where they stood on the social ladder. The reunion was in full swing. White linens draped over circular tables, the clinking of champagne flutes creating a rhythmic chime against the backdrop of a soft jazz quartet. Brenda was in her element. She moved through the crowd in a sequined cocktail dress that caught the afternoon sun, a glass of expensive Chardonnay glued to her hand. "Oh, it's just a shame about Sarah," Brenda sighed to a group of aunts huddled near the buffet. "I told her Mark would pay their way, but she's so prideful. You know how it is, when you live in that kind of environment, you lose touch with how the real world works. I just hope they show up in something presentable. I'd hate for the club members to think we're related to vagrants." Mark stood beside her, checking his gold-plated watch every 30 seconds. "I'm sure John is just finishing up a shift," Mark chuckled, loud enough for the neighboring table to hear. "Someone has to keep the toilets sparkling at the elementary school, right? It's honest work, I suppose. Not that I'd know. I'm too busy managing 300 employees at the logistics firm." Suddenly, the jazz music seemed to falter. A low, powerful hum began to vibrate through the patio, the unmistakable purr of a high-performance engine. Heads turned toward the long, winding driveway. A black Bentley flying spur, its paint so deep and polished it looked like liquid obsidian, glided toward the valet stand. The windows were tinted to a total blackness, reflecting the stunned faces of the family members like a dark mirror. "Who on earth is that?" Brenda whispered, her eyes narrowing. "The senator isn't supposed to arrive until 6. The car came to a silent halt. A driver in a crisp black uniform stepped out, his movements sharp and professional. He walked to the rear door and opened it with a gloved hand. A woman stepped out first. A collective gasp rippled through the patio. She was wearing an emerald green silk gown that flowed around her legs like water. Her hair was swept up in a sophisticated chignon, revealing a necklace that made the club's chandelier look like dim candlelight. It was the Eternity Diamond, a stone so large and pure it seemed to glow with its own internal light. "Sarah," someone whispered. It was Sarah, but not the Sarah they knew. The exhaustion was gone. The weary, slumped shoulders of the waitress were replaced by the poise of a queen. She didn't look like she was attending a party. She looked like she was inspecting a property she intended to buy. Then the man stepped out. He buttoned a charcoal gray bespoke suit jacket, the fabric moving with the effortless grace of high-end Italian tailoring. He wore a Patek Philippe watch on his wrist, the very one from the receipt, and held himself with an authority that made the air around him feel heavy. He didn't look like a janitor. He looked like the man who decided the fate of cities. John reached out and took Sarah's hand, tucked it into the crook of his arm, and began to walk up the stairs toward the patio. The crowd parted as if pushed by an invisible force. The silence was absolute, broken only by the click of Sarah's designer heels on the stone. Brenda's glass slipped from her hand. It shattered on the pavement, white wine splashing onto her expensive shoes, but she didn't even blink. Her jaw was literally hanging open, her face a mask of pale, frozen shock. "Hi, Brenda," Sarah said, her voice cool, melodic, and terrifyingly calm. "I hope we're not too late. The Bentley had a bit of trouble with the city traffic." Mark stepped forward, his face turning a mottled shade of purple. He looked at John, then at the car, then back at John's watch. His brain was struggling to reconcile the man he had mocked for a decade with the Titan standing in front of him. What is this, John? Did you steal that car? Is this some kind of sick joke?" John didn't answer immediately. He took a slow, deliberate look around the patio, his gaze lingering on the family members who had turned their backs on Sarah for years. When his eyes landed on Mark, they were as cold as a winter morning in Detroit. "I don't find theft very funny, Mark," John said, his voice the smooth, dangerous baritone of the boardroom. "And I certainly don't joke about my property. This car is mine, this suit is mine, and as of 9 a.m. this morning, this country club is mine as well." A wave of murmurs broke out. Mark let out a forced, hysterical laugh. "You own the club, don't be ridiculous. This club is owned by a private equity group under the Hargrave umbrella. You're just a janitor who's lost his mind." John reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek black metal card. He held it up so the entire family could see the gold-embossed lion crest of Hargrave Global. "You're right about one thing, Mark. It is owned by Hargrave. And as the chairman and majority shareholder of Hargrave Global, I decided I didn't like the way the management was treating its guests. Especially the ones who think they can use this space to bully their own family." The blood drained from Mark's face so fast he had to grab the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. Brenda let out a strangled sound, her hand flying to her throat, her fingers clutching the cheap pearls she had bragged about only an hour before. John Hargrave," Mark whispered, the name coming out like a prayer to a god he had spent his life offending. You're him, the billionaire." "I am," John said, taking a step closer. The bodyguards who had followed them at a discreet distance now moved to his flanks, their presence a silent promise of power. "But to you, I've always just been the help. I've been the man you wanted to give a job moving boxes. I've been the man you laughed at behind your hand while Sarah cried in the next room." John turned to the rest of the family, his voice rising so it carried to the very back of the patio. "For 10 years, my wife defended me. She stood by a man she thought had nothing. She worked double shifts at a diner to make sure we could pay our bills while I watched her, waiting to see if anyone in this family had a shred of the integrity she possesses. And what did I see? I saw you ignore her. I saw you mock her. I saw you treat her like a burden because you thought her husband was beneath you. Sarah stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Brenda. You offered me charity, Brenda. You told me it was embarrassing to be related to us. Well, look at me now. Is this embarrassing enough for you? Brenda began to cry, but they weren't the tears of a sister. They were the tears of a predator who had just realized the prey was a lion. Sarah, please, I didn't know. If I had known, I would have been so different. We're sisters, we're blood. That's the problem, isn't it? Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than a scream. You only care because you know what I have now. You didn't care when I had nothing. That's not sisterhood. That's business, and unfortunately for you, Brenda, I'm very good at business. John looked at Mark, who was now visibly shaking. Mark, I believe you mentioned you work for Dawson Logistics. Mark nodded feebly, unable to find his voice. Dawson is a subsidiary of my tech wing, John said, a predatory smile touching his lips. I spent my morning reviewing your performance. You've been using company funds to finance your little trips to Aspen. You've been inflating your expense reports to pay for that Mercedes in the parking lot. In my world, we call that embezzlement. I can explain, Mark stammered. Don't bother, John said, waving a hand dismissively. The authorities have already been notified. Your desk was cleared out an hour ago. But because Sarah is a kinder person than I am, she asked me to be lenient, so I'm not going to press charges. Mark slumped with relief, a sob of gratitude escaping his throat. Thank you, John. Thank you? Don't thank me yet, John interrupted. You're still fired from the logistics firm, but as it happens, there's an opening in the maintenance department at Lincoln Elementary. They need a new janitor. Someone to scrub the toilets and empty the trash. I've already put in a word for you. The pay is $15 an hour. You start Monday. I suggest you wear comfortable shoes, Mark. It's a very big school. The irony was a physical blow. Mark looked like he was going to vomit. Brenda was sobbing into her hands, the sequins on her dress mocking her with every shake of her shoulders. The rest of the family stood in frozen silence, terrified that John's gaze would turn toward them next. John turned back to Sarah, his expression softening instantly. The billionaire disappeared, and for a moment the husband returned. Are you ready to leave, Sarah? I think we've said everything that needs to be said. Sarah looked at her sister one last time, at the broken, desperate woman who had built her life on a foundation of sand. She felt no joy in the destruction, only a deep, profound sense of closure. The weight she had carried for 10 years was gone. Yes, Sarah said, her voice clear and strong. Let's go home, John. The real home. As they walked back toward the Bentley, the family watched in total shamed silence. The valet held the door open, his head bowed. As the car pulled away, leaving the Oakwood Country Club behind, Sarah looked at John. Was it worth it? She asked. John took her hand, kissing her knuckles. Every second, because now the world knows what I've known for 10 years, that you are the wealthiest person I have ever met. The drive away from the Oakwood Country Club was unlike any other journey they had shared. For a decade, their car rides had been punctuated by the sounds of a struggling engine and the mental math of gas prices. Now, the only sound was the faint, expensive hum of the Bentley's tires against the pavement and the soft ticking of the Patek Philippe on John's wrist. The city of Detroit blurred past them, a landscape of neon and shadow, but for the first time it didn't look like a cage, it looked like a canvas. Sarah leaned her head back against the hand-stitched leather seat, her eyes closed. She felt lighter, but there was a strange, lingering ache in her chest. The revenge had been swift and absolute, but the silence between her and John was still filled with the ghosts of the last 10 years. Where are we going? She asked softly, not opening her eyes. To the penthouse, to the world of marble and glass. No, John said, his voice steady. We're going to the apartment on 4th Street. We have things to pack. And I think we both need one more night in a place where we don't have a doorman. When they arrived at the old apartment, it felt smaller than it had that morning. The peeling wallpaper, the stained linoleum, the smell of old wood and lingering pine cleaner. It felt like a costume they were finally taking off. They didn't turn on the television. They didn't check their phones, which were undoubtedly blowing up with messages from long-lost relatives. Instead, they sat on the floor of the living room, leaning against the radiator that always hissed, and ate a plain cheese pizza from the shop on the corner. I called the school district while you were in the shower, John said, tossing a crust back into the box. I'm donating a new gymnasium, a state-of-the-art computer lab, and a $10 million endowment for teacher salaries. But I told them it has to be named after the woman who supported the man who cleaned their floors, the Sarah Miller Center for Excellence. Sarah felt a tear escape and track through the dust on her cheek. I'm still mad at you, John. You know that, right? The diamond is beautiful and the school is wonderful, but you let me believe we were failing. I know, John whispered, reaching out to tuck a stray hair behind her ear. And I will spend every day for the next 50 years making sure you never feel that way again. I didn't just hide the money, Sarah. I hid myself because I was afraid I wasn't enough without it. You proved me wrong every single day. You loved the janitor. Now I have to learn how to be a man who deserves that love. The aftermath of the reunion was a storm that leveled the family tree. Mark didn't show up for his first day as a janitor at Lincoln Elementary. He couldn't handle the humiliation of actually working for a living. Within 3 months, the Mercedes was repossessed, and the house in the suburbs was foreclosed upon. Brenda, stripped of the status she had used as a weapon, found herself ignored by the very friends she had tried so hard to impress. They learned in the harshest way possible that when you build your identity on the misery of others, you have nothing to stand on when the tide turns. But Sarah and John didn't watch the wreckage. They were too busy building. They moved out of the 4th Street apartment, but they didn't go to a gated community. They bought a historic home in the city and turned it into a foundation. Sarah quit the diner, but she didn't stop serving. She became the director of a program that provided legal and financial aid to service workers, the invisible people she had once stood among. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the lobby of the Millennium Tower. She wasn't wearing a silk gown or millions in diamonds. She was wearing a simple, professional suit. The security guard, the same one who had once tried to escort her out, now stood at attention, his face flushed with a mixture of respect and genuine warmth. "Good morning, Mrs. Hargrave," he said, holding the elevator for her. "Good morning, Marcus," she replied with a genuine smile. "How's your daughter's college application coming along?" "She got the scholarship, ma'am." "Thanks to your foundation, we don't know how to thank you. Just keep the door open for the next person, Marcus," she said as the doors slid shut. She went up to the 60th floor. John was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city. He wasn't wearing a suit today, he was in a sweater and jeans. He looked at peace. He looked like the man from the 4th Street kitchen, but without the stoop in his shoulders. "The board meeting is in 10 minutes, Sarah said, walking up behind him and wrapping her arms around his waist. "Let them wait," John said, turning in her arms. "I was just thinking about that electric bill. $142. "Don't remind me," Sarah laughed. "No, I want to remember," John said, his expression becoming serious. "I want to remember it every time I sign a check for $1 million. Because the second we forget what it's like to worry about the light bill, we've lost. That's the secret, Sarah. The wealth isn't in the tower. It's in the struggle we survive together. We live in a world that tells us we are what we own. We are told that our value is determined by the brand of our clothes, the zip code of our home, and the title on our business card. We look at the man cleaning the hallway and we see a failure. We look at the woman serving our coffee and we see someone who didn't try hard enough. But this story isn't about a billionaire. It's about the truth that lies beneath the surface. John Hargrave had all the money in the world, but he was a beggar until he met a woman who saw his soul through the bleach and the grime. Brenda had all the status she could dream of, but she was bankrupt because she had no empathy. Karma isn't just about the bad guy losing. Karma is a mirror. It reflects back to you exactly what you give to the world. If you give contempt to those you think are below you, the world will eventually look down on you. If you give love to those who have nothing, the world will eventually give you everything that matters. Never judge a book by its cover. Never assume that the person cleaning your mess isn't the one who could change your life. And most importantly, Never forget that the greatest wealth you will ever possess is the character you show when you think no one is watching. Sarah Miller washed a janitor's clothes for 10 years, and in return, she found a king. Not because of his money, but because of his heart. And John scrubbed floors for a decade just to find one person who would love him for free. In the end, they both got exactly what they deserved. If this story resonated with you, please like this video. Your support means everything to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of the powerful stories we have in store. We've got many more stories about strong people facing difficult fates, stories that may just change the way you look at the world. Share this video with friends because someone right now might need to hear exactly these words. Remember, you owe nothing to anyone except yourself. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did you like the story? Where are you listening from? Thank you so much for your sweet support, and I can't wait to read your comments. On the screen, you'll find two new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more to come on the channel, so subscribe and stay tuned for the next story. With love and respect, see you soon.